Hi everyone. Today I have the pleasure of receiving on my channel a wonderful Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, who has a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in theology. He has worked in apologetics since the 1980s and he has produced many books defending the Christian faith, defending the existence of God, mere Christianity. And so today we're going to ask him lots of questions. And first of all, Bill, welcome to the show.
Very good to be with you, Mathieu. I'm grateful for the invitation.
So could you please briefly present yourself? How did you get started in apologetics, and what has been your journey up until now?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, I am a Christian American philosopher and theologian. I have been a professor at Talbot School of Theology in California, and I'm the founder and president of an online ministry called Reasonable Faith. And the goal is to provide both print materials as well as online videos and animations and so forth in defense of the Christian faith.
Great. And so you've been most well known for your work in philosophy on the Kalam cosmological arguments. So could you please explain the Kalam in a nutshell?
Mm-hmm. The argument can be very simply formulated. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist. Three, therefore, the universe has a cause. And then you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And a number of striking properties can be recovered from such an analysis. It turns out that the argument leads to the existence of a first, beginningless, uncaused, changeless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe.
And so, what have been the most well-known philosophical objections to the second premise of the argument, which is the crucial one on the beginning of the universe? You give two arguments in your work, one based on the impossibility of an actual infinite, and the second one based on the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition. What have been the most popular objections to these two arguments, and how would you respond to them?
I think that with respect to these arguments, probably the most popular objections that are not just based on misunderstandings is that the infinite is just very strange. It is very weird, but that gives us no reason to think that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. And so when I share these various metaphysical absurdities like Hilbert's Hotel, typically the skeptic will have to simply bite the bullet and say that these things are not absurd and he's willing to live with them. So the goal in this case is to try to raise the price tag of skepticism as high as you can by showing so many different absurdities that would result from the existence of an actually infinite number of past events. Another objection, particularly to the argument that you cannot form an actually infinite collection of things by adding one member after another, is that if this argument was successful in proving the finitude of the past, then it would also prove the finitude of the future, which contradicts Jewish, Christian, Muslim beliefs about the immortality of human persons. And I think that the best response to this objection is to draw attention to the theory of time that underlies the Kalam cosmological argument. Namely, it is a tensed or dynamic theory of time according to which temporal becoming is real. Things really do come into existence and go out of existence. And so on that view, if the past is actually infinite, then there have been an actually infinite number of past events prior to today. But the future is infinite only in the sense that the series of events in the later than direction is potentially infinite, not actually infinite. That is to say, it is always finite, but always growing toward infinity as a limit, which it endlessly approaches but never reaches. And so I think when we properly understand these notions, these objections fall away.
And do you think the Kalam depends on the A theory of time, or that you can give some philosophical arguments with also the B theory of time that is compatible with B theory? I think Andrew Locke has developed some arguments in this direction. Do you agree with them?
For the sake of our listeners, let's clarify the terminology here. I spoke of a dynamic or tensed theory of time. And as you say, Mathieu, this is often called the A theory of time. The opposite of this is sometimes called the B theory of time. And according to this view, all events in time are equally real, and temporal becoming is just an illusion of human consciousness. In fact, nothing ever comes into being or passes away. The events on the timeline are stretched out like a spatial line. And so, for example, even though a meter stick might have a beginning prior to the first centimeter, that doesn't mean that it begins to exist. And so on this B theory of time, you have all events in time as equally real. Now, I think that it's very difficult to put through the Kalam argument on the B theory of time. I think in particular, the second argument based on the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition presupposes the reality of temporal becoming. But there is a very bright philosopher from Singapore named Andrew Locke, whom you mentioned, who has defended the Kalam cosmological argument, even given this B or tenseless theory of time. So while I'm not convinced, I certainly welcome Andrew's attempt to defend the argument on that theory of time.
And there have been other philosophers like Robert Coons and Alexander Pruss who have developed other philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past. And in his book, Infinity, Causation and Paradox, Alex Pruss mentions the Grim Reaper paradox. But he also has an interesting small section in the beginning of his book where he argues that any causal regress can be reduced to circular causation. And he gives the examples of chicken and eggs causing each other. If you have a chicken egg, going back infinitely through the past, you could ask the question, why do the eggs exist? And the answer would be, well, it's because the chickens exist. And then when you ask the question, why do the chicken exist? Well, the answer is because the eggs exist. And so you have the circular explanation, and circular explanation or causation is impossible, and hence we should reject the possibility of this infinite causal chain, chicken egg. But if the past were possible, then it would be metaphysically possible to construct an infinite regress of chicken egg. What do you think of this argument?
That first argument that, as you say, is briefly mentioned only in chapter 1 of Pruss's book is really Thomas Aquinas's argument against the possibility of an infinite causal regress. Thomas thought that it was limited only to hierarchically ordered causes, but he didn't think it would apply to temporally ordered causes, going chronologically back into the past. But Pruss makes an advance over Aquinas in this respect by saying, no, the argument applies to temporal causal regresses as well. And I think he presents a pretty persuasive case that you cannot have any sort of event that is the product of an infinite number of causes, either chronologically prior or hierarchically prior. But the bulk of the book is the presentation of these wonderful probability paradoxes if there were an infinite past. And here, as a mathematician, Pruss is just unexcelled in dealing with these paradoxes. And I was so thrilled to see both Rob Coons and Alex Pruss come out in favor of the Kalam cosmological argument. Usually, when a philosopher offers an argument for something like God's existence, what happens is everybody else dumps on it and criticizes it and attacks it, and most of the discussion will be dealing with objections. And so to have such eminent philosophers as Pruss and Coons come out in support of the argument was just a tremendous encouragement to me. And I think that their arguments are very good.
And it's also quite funny because they're Thomists, and historically Aquinas was opposed of proving the finitude of the past. And it's nice that to see in the 20th century or 21st century, we have Thomists who actually start defending some versions of the Kalam. And so, yeah, I think it's there's some irony here.
There definitely is. When you read the Summa Contra Gentiles by Thomas, he has long chapters devoted to the Kalam cosmological argument, which was being pressed by the medieval Islamic philosophers. And he admits that these are good probability arguments for the beginning of the universe and the existence of God. But for Thomas, in order to be a good argument for God, the argument had to be demonstratively certain. It had to demonstrate its conclusion with absolute certainty. And he didn't think the Kalam argument rose to so high a level as that. Well, in today's philosophical culture, no one would insist on so high a standard for a successful argument. If you can show that your conclusion is highly probable on the evidence, then you will have presented a successful argument. And so I think it's really good that these contemporary Thomists are seeing that, in fact, Thomas didn't really refute the argument.
And I'm pretty sure that's Alexander Pruss and Rob Coons can think that these demonstrations, at least demonstrations like that, you can reach metaphysical certainty with these kinds of arguments because, well, at least Vatican I says that you can reach by reason alone the existence of God with metaphysical certainty. And so it's actually a dogma of the Catholic faith that reason alone can prove with certainty the existence of God. It's in Vatican I in Dei Filius, the dogmatic constitution. And so, yeah, that's actually a magisterial authority for us. But yeah, perhaps I want to have your thoughts on this. In Aquinas, there's an inconsistency, I think, because he thinks that actual infinites are impossible. He has a section in the Summas saying that actual infinites are impossible. Yet he holds that it could be metaphysically possible to have an infinite past, and this seems to be like obviously false, right? You could read the arguments against Aquinas saying if an infinite past were possible, then an actual infinite would be possible. But yes, premise 2, actual infinites are impossible, and he concedes premise 2. And so you only need to give an argument for premise 1, saying that if an infinite past were possible, then you could have an actual infinite, and it's very easy to do that. For example, God creates ex nihilo, one atom every day since the beginningless past. The numbers of atoms today would be an actual infinite. And so Aquinas would have to hold that God would not be metaphysically capable of creating ex nihilo one atom every day from a beginningless past. And that's absurd, right? So
Right.
that's an argument I have
I
against
think
Aquinas.
I think you're right, Mathieu, that there's a real tension here in Thomas's thought. And in fact, he himself gives a wonderful illustration of a blacksmith who is working from eternity in his workshop, and he continues to break his hammer as he works the iron. And so, if he's been doing this from eternity past, then how many hammers would there be today that have been discarded by the blacksmith? Well, there would be an actually infinite number of broken hammers as a result of his work. So Thomas himself gives a great illustration of how you can generate an actually infinite number of things if the past is infinite.
Absolutely. So perhaps we can go now to the scientific evidence for the Kalam, because in your work in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you give these two metaphysical arguments, but you also have scientific evidence you present afterwards for a probable argument for the beginning of the universe. And so you give scientific evidence based on the Big Bang, the second law of thermodynamics, and the Born-Good-Vilenkin theorem. How do you think these arguments make a good case for the beginning of the universe?
When I first did my work on the Kalam cosmological argument at the University of Birmingham in England, it was primarily a philosophical study, but I was vaguely aware that contemporary cosmology was saying that there's good evidence that the universe began to exist. And so I began to look into it. And I was absolutely stunned by what I discovered. What I found is that the standard model controlling contemporary astrophysics is that the universe is not past eternal, but had an absolute beginning that's been dated somewhere around 13.8 billion years ago, and that it's been expanding ever since. And there is no naturalistic explanation where the universe came from. It just appears from nothing a finite time ago. It is an absolute beginning of the universe. And the cosmological evidence in support of this model continues to accumulate. And the Born-Good-Vilenkin theorem that you mentioned is simply one of the more recent singularity theorems that show that under a very general single condition, a beginning of the universe at a point in the finite past is inevitable, that it cannot be avoided. So the expansion of the universe provides very good evidence that the universe is not past eternal, but had an absolute beginning. In addition to that is the evidence of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics holds that in a closed system, energy will be diffused, and therefore the available energy to do work will decline. This is called the increase in entropy. And if the universe has existed from infinite past, then we should now be in a state in which there is no work that can be done whatsoever. The universe should be a dark, dilute, lifeless state, but it's not. And the best explanation for why we find the universe in its present state of disequilibrium is known as the past hypothesis. And the past hypothesis says that the universe began to exist a finite time ago, and that its initial energy was simply put in at the moment of creation as an initial condition. And so, in addition to the philosophical arguments, we have these two independent scientific arguments that make the beginning of the universe much more probable than not.
And I've heard some videos of Alan Guth saying afterwards that he didn't think that his theorem proved the beginning of the universe with absolute certainty, and that we didn't really know for the beginning. And whereas Vilenkin seems to be more on the side of yes, there is a beginning, and the theorem goes in that direction. Have you heard of these Alan Guth reactions, and
Oh,
what would you
yes.
say to respond?
Well, there's a couple of things to be said. First, the idea of certainty, as you pointed out earlier, Mathieu, is an irrelevance. No one is talking about looking for certainty about these matters. Science is always provisional, and therefore what we try to do is to show that the best scientific evidence that we have supports this premise that the universe began to exist. And so what Vilenkin claims is that relative to the evidence of thermodynamics and the expansion of the universe, it is highly probable that the universe began to exist. And I think that conclusion is well established. The other thing that needs to be said about Guth is that I have seen private correspondence from Alan Guth that was shared with me by Daniel Kaim, a philosopher at the University of Liverpool in England, in which Guth says that the reason he thinks that the past might be eternal is on the basis of a particular model of the universe, according to which, as you go back in time, at some point, the arrow of time flips over and runs in the opposite direction for infinity. Now, far from avoiding the beginning of the universe, this model actually implies it, because that mirror universe is in no sense in our past. When you hit the surface that joins, when you hit the surface that joins these two universes, the arrow of time runs in opposite directions. So you really have two distinct universes with a common beginning point. So it turns out that the model that Guth was talking about actually implies the beginning of the universe.
That's interesting. I didn't know about this private correspondence. Perhaps now we can turn to another argument you defend in natural theology, which is the fine-tuning arguments for the universe. And so, in a nutshell, what is the fine-tuning arguments, and what would be your objection to your response to the multiverse objection?
All right. The expression fine-tuning does not mean designed. That's very important to understand, or the argument looks like it's circular. Fine-tuning means that the constants and quantities that are found in the mathematical equations that express the laws of nature must fall into an incomprehensibly tiny life-permitting range. Otherwise, there would be no embodied conscious life in the universe. And so the question is, how do you best explain this fine-tuning so understood? And there are basically three alternatives. One would be just chance. All the constants and quantities just happen to fall into the life-permitting range. And I think the problem with that is that the odds of this happening by chance are virtually infinitesimal. They're incomprehensible, so that's not a good explanation. The other way would be to say that they're physically necessary, that these constants and quantities must have the values they do. And again, that's not a very good explanation, because scientists can develop theoretical models of the universe which have the same laws of nature but different values of the constants and quantities and describe what those universes would be like. And so there's absolutely nothing about the laws of nature that would suggest that these constants and quantities have to have the value they do. The third explanation would be design, that there is a transcendent mind or cosmic designer who has fine-tuned the universe to be life permitting. Now, the multiverse objection that you mentioned is an attempt to rescue the alternative of chance by multiplying our probabilistic resources. For example, it is much more probable that if you spin the roulette wheel, that your ball will come up on the red 22 if there are hundreds of thousands of roulette wheels spinning with balls being thrown. Somewhere in that collection of roulette wheels, by chance alone, the ball might come up red 22. So similarly, what multiverse proponents say is that our universe is not all there is. There is a world ensemble of different, causally unconnected universes out there, and they are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities, so that by chance alone, somewhere in the ensemble, a finely tuned universe will appear by chance. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that we see that the constants and quantities are fine-tuned for our existence, because if they weren't fine-tuned, then we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. So given that we are here, we should expect the universe to look fine-tuned. Now, what is the fallacy with that reasoning? Well, I think the most important argument against it is the so-called Boltzmann brain objection that was developed originally by the Austrian physicist Ludwig Boltzmann. And what the objection points out is that in order to be an observable universe, a universe does not have to be fine-tuned. In fact, there can be universes that have freak observers, a single brain that fluctuates into existence out of the vacuum with illusory perceptions of an external world. So that if there is a randomly ordered multiverse of worlds, we could never know that we are ordinary, respectable observers who can trust our sense impressions rather than Boltzmann brains who live in a sort of solipsistic world of our own creation. Well, no sane person believes that he's a Boltzmann brain. And therefore, I think this alternative to design is just utterly unavailing.
Great. Would you like to speak about one of the other natural theology arguments you've developed, or would you like us to talk about the historical evidence for Christianity?
Well, I have just published a new book with the ethicist David Baggett on the moral argument for the existence of God. And I frankly find this to be probably the most persuasive and compelling argument for the existence of God. My favorite is the Kalam argument, but I have to admit that I think the moral argument is far more persuasive to most people. And one version of that argument goes like this. If God, premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, if there is no God to serve as the absolute plumb line for moral values and duties, then everything becomes relative. So that if God does not exist, there are no objective moral values and duties. Premise two is, but there are objective moral values and duties. In our moral experience, we apprehend moral values that impose themselves upon us and moral duties that we all have. One agnostic philosopher, Michael Ruse, has stated that the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Now, that puts these moral truths on the same level of necessity and certainty as the elementary truths of arithmetic. And so I think we have very good reason to believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties. And in that case, it follows logically that therefore God exists.
And in response to this argument, there's a difference between what you see in academia, which would object to premise one and defend object to premise one and defend objective moral values and duties, like Eric Wielenberg with moral Platonism. And in the lay audience and the non-academic audience, they would contest the other premise and just defend nihilism and relativism. And so, do you agree with this assessments? And what would you say in both cases?
I do agree with you. Sociological surveys have shown that students are actually more relativistic than university professors. And of the university professors, the philosophers are the ones who are least likely to be moral relativists, who believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties. So you're absolutely right. In the academy, premise 2, that there are objective moral values and duties, is not widely disputed. That seems to be more an opinion in pop culture, where people think that moral values and duties are just subjective expressions of personal preference. And the difficulty for that, I think, is that when you probe a little bit, I think you'll find that 98% of people really do believe that there are objective moral values and duties. Look, for example, in our culture at the moral denunciation of homophobia, for example, or discrimination, or tyranny and fascism. People make moral judgments all the time. And so, for example, someone like Richard Dawkins, who gives lip service to relativism, is actually himself a moralist whose book, The God Delusion, is just filled with moral pronouncements. And so I think that the average man who tries to deny the objectivity of moral values and duties is really deeply conflicted. And if you'll just talk to him a little while, give him some examples. Say, for example, do you really think that the medieval crusades were a good thing? Do you really think that the Spanish Inquisition was morally good? They'll almost always come around and say, no, I guess there are some things that really are morally wrong afterwards, after all.
And you've also defended in your work a case for the resurrection of Jesus, because after showing the existence of God through natural theology, we have to ask ourselves, does this God that we've established his existence by natural reason alone, has he revealed himself in the world in a particular religion? And so the resurrection is the central piece to analyze here, because if the resurrection is true, then Christianity is true and all the other non-Christian religions are false. And if the resurrection is false, then Christianity is false. So everything stands on the resurrection. And so you've done extensive doctoral work on this, and you've published a great book called The Sun Rises, The Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus, which I've used in my personal work and apologetics. So I want to thank you for that. And so could you please summarize your case for the resurrection here.
Yes, this flowed out of my work at the University of Munich under Wolfhard Pallenberg, who is one of the most eminent, was one of the most eminent systematic theologians in the world, who defended the resurrection of Jesus historically. And it seems to me that a case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection has two parts. Part one is establishing the facts to be explained. And then part two is offering what is the best explanation of those facts. Now, with regard to part one, what are the facts to be explained? It seems to me that the evidence can be summarized broadly under three major facts. Number one, that on the Sunday morning following Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered to be empty by a group of his female followers. Number two, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people on multiple occasions and under varying circumstances saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And thirdly, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, what may surprise our listeners is that those three facts are not simply the beliefs of conservative Christians, Catholics, or Protestants. Those represent the conclusions of the wide majority of New Testament critics today who have written on these subjects, whether they are Christian conservatives or liberals or agnostics or even Jews. So the facts, I think, are well established. And in my books, I try to lay out multiple lines of evidence for each of those three facts. That takes you then to part two. What is the best explanation of these facts? And I think that when you assess the various alternative explanations of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the origin of the disciples' faith, by the standard criteria that historians use, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth, that the explanation that I call the resurrection hypothesis, namely God raised Jesus from the dead, is the best explanation of those facts.
And so, if you were a skeptic, what would be the most plausible alternative theory to the resurrection, and why do you think it fails?
That's a really interesting question because most of the naturalistic theories are so bad that none of them has generated significant support among contemporary scholars. If you had to come up with an alternative, I think that it would have to be a kind of complex or composite theory. You would explain the empty tomb by saying that there was working in Jerusalem at that time an unknown necromancer who was dealing in body parts of deceased people, particularly executed criminals. And he would use these body parts in magical spells and potions in his work as a necromancer. And so what he did after Jesus was crucified and laid in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, with the help perhaps of associates, he stole the corpse of Jesus out of the tomb in order to use it for its body parts in his magic formulae. So that would be the empty tomb. Now, what do you do about the post-mortem appearances? Well, it seems to me that you have to conjoin then to that hypothesis an independent hypothesis, namely that what the disciples saw after Jesus' death were what are sometimes called bereavement visions. People who have lost a loved one, particularly a spouse, will often testify that they have suddenly seen their spouse appear in the bedroom and speak to them. And these visions of the deceased can be extremely real, as real as though the person were actually there. And so what the skeptic might say is that the disciples, having lost their beloved teacher, projected these bereavement visions of him alive from the dead, and that led them mistakenly to infer that Christ was risen from the dead, and therefore they came to believe in his resurrection. Well, what responses might one make to this? Well, there are multiple problems with this theory. Perhaps the most basic problem is that it fails the test of simplicity. It doesn't have a single explanation for all three facts. You have to cobble together these two independent theories about a necromancer working in Jerusalem and then these bereavement visions to get your theory. And by contrast, the resurrection hypothesis is a simpler theory that explains all three lines of evidence and therefore is to be preferred. Moreover, in terms of each individual theory, the idea that there was a necromancer working in Jerusalem is really, really highly improbable. Necromancy was regarded as blasphemous and against Jewish law and religion. And so there is absolutely no evidence out of the first century that there was necromancy being practiced in Judea. The evidence we have for necromancy comes from the 3rd century AD, primarily from Egypt, where there are these magical papyri that describe these formulae and potions and so forth. And then in Greco-Roman literature, you have stories about witches and magic spells and things of that sort using body parts. But these are not historical. These are just fantasies. They're kind of like stories of the boogeyman that you use to scare people. They're not real. So the idea that there would be someone in Jerusalem trafficking in unclean body parts and who would have the audacity to steal the body out of the tomb, I think is really, really far-fetched. In terms of the bereavement visions, of course, a problem there is going to be the physicality of the resurrection appearances. If Jesus did appear physically and bodily to the disciples, then they cannot be regarded as visionary. But leave that point aside. Wholly apart from that, there's just nothing in the psychological case books of either psychology or parapsychology comparable to the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Jesus didn't appear just one time, but many times, not just to individuals, but to groups of people, not just under one circumstance and on one occasion, but under a wide variety of circumstances and on multiple occasions, not just to believers significantly, but also to unbelievers and even enemies. So there's just nothing comparable in the literature on bereavement visions that would be comparable to these resurrection appearances.
Yes, and the case for the resurrection that you've put forward, there's the minimalist camp and the maximalist camp in the literature, and the maximalist objection to the case is to say that you need these details in the Gospels of people touching Jesus, speaking with him, having this real interaction to argue against the hallucination hypothesis. If you only focus on Paul, you don't have that much details of the disciples speaking, touching Jesus. And so to make the case really solid and strong, you need to rely on a more maximalist case, or at least you need to defend first gospel reliability, not inerrancy, but reliability before making the case, and that you cannot rest on the Habermas or Licona way of arguing much on Paul and leaving the gospel aside. What is your stance on this
Well,
objection
in
from
my
the
work,
maximalist?
I don't take that other approach. You will find a lengthy discussion of the physicality of the resurrection appearances in the Gospels, looking at each appearance in turn and its historical credibility. But I would disagree that the case for the postmortem appearances depends essentially on that. I think that the case against visionary appearances can be made independently of the defense of their physicality, as I just said a moment ago in explaining the unparalleled nature of these resurrection appearances.
And what is your stance on Lewis's trilemma? Either Jesus is right when he says he's God, or he's a fool, or he is a liar. And so this is the trilemma you have to choose. Do you think this is a good argument? Yeah, what is your stance on this?
Well, C.S. Lewis said that given Jesus' claims to divine status, he was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was the Lord. In English, you have their very nice alliteration of 3 L's: liar, lunatic, or Lord. But I think that Lewis left out a fourth alternative, and that also starts with L, namely legend. Modern skeptical critics would not say that Jesus was a liar or that he was a lunatic, but they would say that the gospel records of Jesus' claims to divinity are legends that accrued over the years and over the decades and got changed and altered in their transmission until they finally came to be recorded in the Gospels. And so one of the tasks of the contemporary apologists will be to make a case for the historicity of Jesus' radical personal claims, to show why they are authentic claims, that is to say, claims actually uttered by the historical Jesus.
Yes, exactly. And I think this can be done. And Brent Petrie, a scholar, a Catholic scholar on this, has done great work, even arguing only from the synoptics. You can show it with Mark 2 and the trial with Caiaphas in Mark 14. So this can be argued, I think, even from the synoptics. Yeah.
Yeah, the trial scene in Mark is remarkable because there all 3 of these titles come together, where Jesus claims to be the unique Son of God, the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, and the long-awaited Messiah. All 3 of these come together in the trial scene. And so it's no wonder they condemned him for blasphemy.
Perhaps we can talk about the most well-known objection to Christian theism, which is the problem of evil. And so the problem of evil has 2 forms: the logical version and the probabilistic version, the evidential version. What is your general line of response to the problem of evil? And what is your favorite theodicy?
I distinguish between the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. The intellectual problem of evil concerns how to reconcile the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God with the horrible evil and suffering in the world. The emotional problem of evil deals with how to dissolve people's dislike of a God who would permit them or other innocent people to suffer so terribly. And I am convinced, on the basis of many years of experience, that for most people, the problem of evil and suffering is not an intellectual problem. It's really an emotional problem. They just simply reject a God who would permit them or others to suffer so terribly. As an intellectual problem, I think that contemporary philosophers have shown that the problem of evil places a burden of proof on the atheist's shoulders that is so enormous that no one has ever been able to sustain it. To put his argument through, the atheist would have to show that it's either impossible or highly improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the observed suffering and evil in the world. But how could he possibly prove that? How could he possibly know that God does not have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering? And therefore, I think that the intellectual version of the problem of evil in either its logical or probabilistic form is really impossible to put through.
Mm. And as for the theodicies, theists usually apply to free will, but then there's the objection of natural evil that does not depend on free will or an animal suffering, things like that. So we need to say more than free will. What is your stance on the fallen angel theodicy, explaining natural evil through the fall of the angels created after creation, and that's when natural evil entered into the world, and that caused the natural evil. And so natural evil could be reduced to freedom of the will from the angels. And yeah.
I don't think very many people would take that seriously as a theodicy. It just seems fantastic to think that there are fallen angels pushing tectonic plates about causing earthquakes in Venezuela, for example. Rather, Alvin Plantinga, perhaps the greatest living Christian philosopher, offered that not as a theodicy, but simply as a defense. What he was trying to show is that it's logically possible that all the evil in the world could be due to free will. But he's not saying that's the actual explanation. There's a difference between a defense and a theodicy. And he was simply offering that suggestion in order to show that the atheist has not been able to prove that there is a logical inconsistency between God and the evil and suffering in the world. Now, in terms of my own thinking, if I were to offer a theodicy, it would go something like this. I think that as a good and loving God, God's goal in human history is to bring as many people as possible into the kingdom of God. I think that he wants to build loving relationships with as many people as possible, that there would be as few people as possible that would reject him and his love, and that he would be able to win the free consent of the maximum number of people to his love and grace. And so his goal then is to providentially order the world in such a way that there is an optimal balance between saved and lost. He would not want to create any more of the lost than was necessary to create the maximal number of the saved. So both in terms of absolute numbers and in terms of the ratio between saved and lost, God would want to create an optimal balance between these. And then I would say it is not at all implausible that the actual world has such an optimal balance. Keep in mind that the actual world includes not only the past and the present, but also the future as well. And I honestly believe that it is not at all improbable, not a whit improbable, that only in a world suffused with both natural and moral evil, that the optimal number of people would freely come to embrace God and find salvation. What the atheist, again, would have to show is that there is a world that is feasible for God, that he could have actualized, that has a more optimal balance between saved and lost, and yet involves less evil and suffering. But how could the atheist possibly prove something like that? It's sheer speculation.
Yes, and we can even concede as theists that evil gives some evidence in favor of atheism or naturalism, but we could say there's more evidence on the other side that compensates the evidence that it gives to atheism. So you have to take into account the global evidence we have, the total
I agree.
evidence. And so, yeah, that's what I would say.
I
as it
agree.
also,
I'm just highlighting some brief points here for the sake of our listeners. In my published work, I go into this in greater depth, and I certainly agree with your point that the problem of evil and suffering is not to be considered in isolation, but the question is God's existence improbable relative to the full scope of the evidence, which includes things like the absolute beginning of the universe at a point in the finite past, the fine-tuning of the universe for embodied conscious agents, the existence of objective moral values in the world, and the historical evidence for the facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus. When you consider all of the evidence, then I think it's quite probable that Christian theism is true.
and I would add the evidence from contemporary miracles that have been well documented in books like Craig Keener's books on miracles. He has three very good books on miracles. Caleb Jackson has done also very strong work on modern healings that have been documented with medical evidence before and after. And so these need to be taken into account today by the skeptic who needs to find an alternative explanation in all these healings that have been put forward. So yeah, perhaps one last question, one last objection would be on Adam and Eve. Lots of people say today Adam and Eve just contradicts science. It's irrational to believe that we all descend from one couple, Adam and Eve, and we all know through science that polygenism is true. So how would you refute this line of argumentation?
Actually, Mathieu, I want to correct something there. It is not true that contemporary biology believes in polygenesis. It believes in monogenesis. That is to say that the human organism has arisen only one time in history. It would be fantastically improbable if there were independent and multiple origins of the human race on this planet. So monogenesis is the view of evolutionary biology today. But they do not believe that the human race is descended from a founding pair. Rather, there was always a breeding population of human beings on this planet that never got as low as just two persons. And so it's for that reason that they are skeptical of the existence of two human progenitors of the entire race. Now, in my book entitled In Quest of the Historical Adam, I examined both the biblical material to see if we as Christians or believing Jews or Muslims are committed to the existence of a historical Adam and Eve. And I think that we are. I think that anyone who is a Bible-believing person is committed to the existence of original human pair from whom everyone is descended. But I do not think we are committed to saying that they lived relatively recently, say 20,000 years ago or so. But if they lived in the deep primordial past, say somewhere around 750,000 years ago, then the evidence of contemporary population genetics and paleoanthropology is entirely consistent with the existence of a founding human couple, whom we call Adam and Eve. So it's really all about the dating of Adam and Eve. If you date them in the deep past, say somewhere around 750,000 years ago, then there is no conflict with the scientific evidence.
What is your theory for the children of Cain, Abel, and Seth? Do you think the children of Adam and Eve? Do you think they had how did they have babies? Did they have babies like together or with other or breeding with other animals, human-like animals?
Well, if they had sexual intercourse with non-human primates, that would be bestiality. Now, in a sinful fallen world, I don't think you can exclude that that might have gone on, that they did engage in bestiality, but we don't know that. It is possible that they simply interbred within their own family, and within just a few generations, there would be explosive growth so that there wouldn't be any deleterious biological effects from this sort of inbreeding. So I like to think that they probably just married other members of their own family.
Okay, so you prefer incest to bestiality. We have to choose, right?
That's a pejorative way of putting it, but yes, I would say yes, but of course, at that time, it wasn't incest.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Craig, for coming on this channel to speak about apologetics, your great work in philosophy, theology. It's very helpful for us French people to learn from the American and English-speaking philosophers. We don't have that many analytic philosophers in France. And so we're grateful for all the work you've done all these years in these subjects. And I've used a lot of your work for mine. So we want to thank you for that, and perhaps let you give any advice to the French audience who wants to study more apologetics. What would be your last word on this?
Well, I have a talk that is on our Reasonable Faith website at reasonablefaith.org. There are massive amount of resources for Christians for the defense of the faith. And many of these are in French. We have a section where you can get translations in other languages like Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Chinese. And so I would direct our listeners who are native French speakers to look at that material. My book, Reasonable Faith, is also available in French, Foi raisonnable, and I would commend that. But having said that, I think that French Christians today should, like you, Mathieu, make an effort to really master the English language. And the reason for that is that the amount of resources that are available in English is just prodigious. It is far, far in excess of what's available in different European languages. So if you can master English in the way that you have done so beautifully, it will open up a whole new world to you of valuable resources.
I agree. So French people, please learn English, and so that you can read all the great books of Dr. William Lane Craig. We'll recommend your books in the description. And thank you again for coming on this channel. It was a pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure, Mathieu.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.